most 보던 팟캐스트.
Welcome to another episode of the Most Modern Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have Daniel McDermott with us. Daniel McDermott is a greenhouse gas accounting specialist working as a principal environmental consultant. He majored in evolutionary biology in undergrad at Rice before a master's in environmental science at Oregon State. Dan has more than a decade of professional experience in sustainability and environmental protection. He is a 2030 climate champion with the Asia Foundation and was a recipient of the Climate Corp Fellowship Business Case Award through the Environmental Defense Fund. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, we're joined with our co-host, Minku. If you want to say hi.
Hello.
And unfortunately, Alex isn't able to be here with us today, but I'm sure he's with us in spirit. So Dan, where did your interest in the environment begin? Were you always inspired to kind of pursue this career in sustainability?
I actually wasn't. So I always say, what I do is definitely a hobby of mine, and it's definitely very interesting kind of field for me to be in. But I'm not only interested in the environmental aspect, but how quickly something is evolving and becoming so universal.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say that 50% of my interest is for the environment and towards sustainability, but 50% of my interest is looking at this brand new sort of topic that every single individual, every single company, even on TV shows, it's just really coming to the forefront of what's being discussed. And that's what I think has been the most interesting part of this.
Mm-hmm.
My interest within the environmental field in the first place did come from undergrad and just learning a little bit about ecology and how different species are kind of affected by the presence or absence of another. Yeah. It's definitely been a very interesting place to be in because there is a lot of misinformation out there. There is a lot of trying to determine what's good, what's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been very interesting being on sort of the ground level and understanding how everybody is adapting to these different changes.
Mm-hmm.
I must ask, before we go somewhere else, I must ask, what's a 2030 climate champion mean? Like, how did you become a champion?
So the 2030 Climate Champion was a new pilot program for the Asia Foundation, where essentially they matched 5 environmental leaders from the US with 5 environmental leaders from China. And it was the first time they did this program. And the reason why they matched these two together was because these companies historically have had a hard time with collaboration.
Mhm.
And these two countries at the same time, too, are the biggest polluters, have the largest greenhouse gas footprint. There are tons of lessons to be learned from each of the two different countries. And to kind of work together with counterparts within China, the idea was to recognize that some solutions that are being put in place in the US could be done in China and vice versa. It was definitely an interesting program.
Mm-hmm.
It really put into perspective what a lot of the difficulties were when it comes to that collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of things like censorship, time change differences was a huge
Mm-hmm.
aspect. Trying to get together on the same sort of wavelength on what the future looked like. And so it did a really good job of kind of highlighting what a lot of those issues are. But it was also great just to be able to work with these, others within a country that seems very different from ours, but recognizing that we have a lot of the same issues, being both extremely large polluters, but also geographically extremely large countries.
Mm-hmm. Was this like a business organization? Is it like an NGO? Like, what was the setup behind this relationship?
Asia Foundation is actually pretty well known fellowship within Southeast Asia. Headquarters is based out of the US, but they have several programs in which they are funding a lot of the, developmental and sustainability based projects within the continent of Asia. I know that they were very much focused on development at first, and I know that a lot of their funding comes from Asian governments. and now they're kind of stepping a little bit into the sustainability sphere.
Well, as a developer and a designer, my head is always in the built environment. So I'm very curious about what does a career look like in sustainability outside of real estate realm, so outside of the built environment. Like, what do you learn about? What do you study during the environmental science course, and how does that knowledge get applied to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I would say that, with the environmental science course being a master's, a lot of it was grounded within research that is being done on human impacts on the environment. The way that I like to think about it is that the research is 10 to 15 years ahead of what is actually being instituted today. So we learn about all of these things like, the amount of methane released from cows burping. But, you know, now that we know that, okay, what do we do about it?
Hmm.
And that delay is pretty extreme. The role I like to consider myself in is trying to, I guess, bridge that gap a little bit.
Hmm.
I am very much working with more of the private sector, large corporations that are trying to implement environmental initiatives to, create sort of a more healthy planet to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And when it comes to the science, it's very much fact-based. It's very much about um, the impacts. It is about quantifiable sort of impacts on how people can affect the environment. But when it comes to corporations, there is a whole new level of understanding that needs to come along with it. How exactly do you roll out an initiative to um, all of your different organizations? If you owned 7,000 buildings and you want to improve energy efficiency within each of those buildings, how exactly do you go about that? How do you create that priority list? How do you determine what exactly is going to be the most effective use of your resources? And that's where I think that I have developed a large understanding over the last several years, is that difficulty in not just saying, hey, I want to do the right thing and I want to improve the environment, but given limited resources, limited time, it doesn't matter how much motivation you have, there's a proper way to roll out these initiatives in an improper way. And trying to understand the most effective way of getting these kind of things rolled out is really kind of what I have been very interested in.
You mentioned earlier that sustainability is a rapidly changing field, that you've really been boots on the ground with these companies for a really long time. Can you tell us a little bit about what has changed in terms of these companies' perspectives, like what they're going after? Because we hear a lot of these like aggressive 2030, 2050, like net zero goals. Like, is that realistic?
In short, not really. Mostly because nobody ever makes a goal based upon a timeline. You think of the finances of a company, and they say by 2030, we want to make double profit. When you are making these forecasts and you're trying to understand what to do, you want to look at yourself as an organization and figure out how you're going to make reductions. And then you can determine what you think those reductions are, and you can quantify what you think those reductions could be based upon the research that you've done and what your plan is. What I think we're seeing a lot of is organizations that are setting a goal first and then trying to figure out how to get to that goal, a quantifiable goal, and then trying to figure out how to get to it. And, I know that a lot of the places that have made these goals, they're, 1 to 2 years in and they're already falling extremely short. And so, yeah, I think the interesting part is that people are invested and they are trying to make decisions. They are very much catering programs and creating environmental departments within their organizations because they do see quite a need, and they do find it extremely important. But to get to something like net neutrality by 2050, it's going to require a lot of new technologies.
Hmm.
It's going to require a lot of extreme um, changes in practices. And the economy can't handle something like those extreme changes in practices. The technology out there doesn't exist yet. And we're making projections and forecasts on technology that doesn't exist, that we don't have a timeline for when it would exist. And it's just kind of crossing fingers and hoping. I would say, though, that people are trying to do everything that they can to reach those goals. I
Hmm.
just don't think that they have the capability to. So it is very interesting to see that there is a lot of motivation to make these reductions. But at the same time, I do think that the goals or the things that they're reaching for are very difficult to achieve.
When we talk about sustainability, you probably have a better idea, a much larger, high level idea of what that impact is in our daily lives. Um, what type of industries did you experience outside of real estate, and does their approach differ from how architecture or architects or the building environment professionals approach sustainability and ESG terms these days?
Yeah, I would say with something like architecture, we need to consider a couple of different sources of greenhouse gases. And this kind of just goes to show, how broad the aspect of greenhouse gases could be. So even if we think about construction, taking it, a little bit step further. With construction, you have construction vehicles. So those are sometimes burning diesel, sometimes gasoline, or maybe they're even using electricity. And those vehicles are basically owned and operated by the construction company. So these are emissions. Anytime that they're burning this fuel, it's going to be considered emissions. They also have electricity. So this electricity is coming from another source. When they are using these battery-powered tractors or forklifts, they're not creating emissions directly themselves, but the energy is being created from somewhere else. It's a fuel mixture. It's coming from a power plant where they're creating that energy by burning multiple different types of fuels. But then the last one is scope 3, which opens up a whole new world, which is how many emissions did it take for that concrete to get from manufacturing to right here at the foundation of this building? If you're importing that concrete from another country, you don't only have to consider the manufacturing process itself, but the transportation. So maybe it came across on a large shipping boat. That boat, it does create emissions because you are burning fuel to get it across the ocean. So you're also bringing that. And then now it needs to be offloaded. Now it needs to be loaded onto trucks who are also burning emissions. And so we look at something simple as a 1 foot block of concrete, but that one piece of material has a lot of different emissions associated with it. So I would say that within the kind of construction, architecture in these areas, so much of the emphasis is kind of put on that procurement cycle,
Mm-hmm.
and determining exactly which materials are the most sustainable. When it comes to other things, let's say you have a company that is like Costco. Costco, I guarantee a majority of their emissions are going to come from that electricity usage.
Mm-hmm.
Big warehouses, they have big departments, and they are running freezers, they're running, refrigerators. And so their focus is going to be on trying to reduce the amount of electricity that they need in order to continue their operations. These are the kind of things that are really under their control. And then you can think of another industry, which I think is probably one of the most interesting, is airlines. Now, technology does not exist to create any sort of renewable energy that would allow a plane to fly. Or there's no such thing as a battery powered airplane because that battery weighs too much and it would just totally drop out of the sky. There's not enough solar to power something like that. There is just kerosene. And so in that instance, we aren't, they're not able to make reductions. So what do they have to do instead? Well, this is where carbon offsets might come into play, that they might try to invest in projects that will allow for the sequestration of carbon in order to offset their own footprint. So, What it really is how much control do each of these companies have over the amount of emissions that they release? And that comes, or it's also called materiality, which is what are the most important emissions that are associated with our organization? And that
Hmm.
comes from the impact, so how many emissions there are, but also the ability to control it. So, if it is an airline and you do want to sort of reduce your overall emissions, but you notice that some of your emissions are coming from employees commuting to work in a car, you don't
Hmm.
have much control over that. Or the amount of emissions that are generated from the airports themselves. You don't have much control over that. So it's both about that impact and that level of control that determine how exactly these different organizations are handling their sustainability programs.
So let's I guess stay on the Costco
Yeah,
example because we love Costco and it's something very tangible I think for us to imagine. So
sure.
I think maybe from your role you work with companies like at the company level. So for a company like Costco, their stores and the construction of the stores is only a part of their overall emissions, right? They have logistics, they have warehousing, like you said, they have employees commuting. So when a company approaches you and say, hey, like we made these targets, we told our investors, now help us get there. How do you approach that problem?
It starts with data. Really, it's all about instituting a standardized and repeatable and sustainable process for understanding what exactly their emissions data is, because
Hmm.
that's what's going to be the basis for the people to determine the performance of how these sustainability initiatives work. So, for example, if we are looking at Costco, the very first thing that I would think we'd want to do is let's get a way to accurately understand what our emissions footprint is. And that's going to come from things by looking at electricity bills. It's going to come from things like looking at the amount of fuel that's used by their fleet vehicles. It's going to come from the amount of refrigerants that are placed within their air conditioning systems. And so it comes from a lot of various different sources. And the idea is to essentially be able to build a process that will allow them to take all of this information and determine exactly what their greenhouse gas footprint is. That in itself, I believe, is 90% of the most difficult part when it comes to setting up a sustainability program. A lot of organizations, they don't have a sustainability team put in place already. This is a
Hmm.
very new concept. And it's also very interdepartmental. You might need data from the accounting group. You need data from your vehicle repair group. You need data from the people that make repairs to the air conditioning on each of your buildings. It comes from all of these different sources. And that's actually one of the things that I am teaching a class about right now is trying to streamline that whole process of being able to get data from the data owners to the people, the subject matter experts that are able to turn that into greenhouse gas emissions, and then be able to put that data, manipulate it, or create key performance metrics and put it in front of the decision makers. And so I think that what I am trying to do at the very beginning is not necessarily say, hey, do this, do that to reduce your footprint. It's let's get the data in place so that you can make the correct decisions and then determine how you're performing over time.
Yeah, as Bloomberg said, in God we trust, everyone bring data, right?
Yeah.
So speaking of data, real estate is notorious of its lack of data. And in our previous episodes, we talk about the difficulty even capturing a very relevant data piece, which is related to design of those buildings, which I assume has a lot of impact and influence over how the sustainability performance and the carbon footprint of those buildings. And even if we can't capture those, rudimentary data, how do we even start calculating all these impacts that you're talking about? I'm just thinking if it's this difficult to gather clean data on the real estate side, is it easier from your experience to gather data on the operations or even on the overall kind of company scale? Or is it worse?
I would say it's a little bit of both. When it comes to the real estate side and you're, talking about design, it sounds like it's kind of a little bit difficult to categorize what data needs to be collected. Is that right?
Mm.
Yeah. So I would say that when it comes to looking at data for greenhouse gases, it's a little bit more known what kind of data you need to collect.
Mm-hmm.
The real question is how do you get it? So, if you are trying to calculate the amount of emissions that are coming from employees commuting to your office building, you could say, okay, I need to know the amount of fuel that is burned from all of my employees' cars. And the ones that take a bus, we need to divide how many bus seats are on that by, and then how much fuel that bus is using. And so it could go down like this crazy path. Or you can sort of make assumptions. You say, okay, well, we have 300 work days. We will assume that 60% of those people are taking a car to work. We'll assume that 20% are taking public transport, another 20% are biking or walking. You could send out surveys to collect that information. You can look up the US Census Bureau of how the average number of miles that people end up traveling to work. So, there's ways to get the data. The actual input into the calculation, again, when it comes to greenhouse gas calculations, it's so simple.
Mm.
It's always just one piece of data times as some sort of emission factor equals emissions. The one difficult part is figuring out what that data is, who has it, who's going to make sure that that data is accurate, how are you going to make sure that you're getting that data point accurately every single month or every single year from the same spot. If you're a corporation and you merge with another organization, how do you make sure that your data is combined together so that you can get it from both companies? If you operate in 17 different countries and you do tons of different currency, what is the process for that? That's the hard part. Is it's not necessarily difficult to categorize what data you need, but when it comes to an organization size and the way that they house the data, it's an extremely difficult thing to try to create that sort of standardized process.
When you're going down this path of looking at data, creating assumptions, is there some parts of the organization that has more accuracy than others? Say, I'm assuming logistics truck fuel. Like that measurement must be a little bit more accurate than making assumptions about people's commute to work, right? Like, how do you balance things that you have to make a lot of assumptions with versus things that you can probably get more accurate data of?
Yeah, number one, definitely always 100% of the time the most accurate data. Financial departments, accounting systems, because that's what they do. They have to track all of their earnings, they have to track all of their expenses, their revenue. And so you can always guarantee that they have a very well established process for that. Didn't always used to be that way, but over time they've recognized that importance. And so the idea is that hopefully over time we see kind of something similar when it comes to environmental data management. As far as making assumptions go, so the way to look at emissions is there's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 sources. Scope 1 sources are direct emission sources where the company's operations directly create those emissions. So this is something like vehicles that are owned and operated by a company that are currently carrying out company business are burning are burning fuel, and that fuel creates emissions.
So Costco's delivery trucks would be scope
Yes,
one. Okay.
Costco's delivery trucks would be scope 1 unless they were contracted, in which they would
Mm,
be scope 3. But we'll get, if Costco had any building heating coming from natural gas purchased, that would be
mm-hmm,
considered scope 1. They're taking that gas, they're burning it, they're creating that heat. I mentioned refrigerants. Those are kind of the main ones. Scope 2 is where you are using energy that was generated by another source, and that source caused emissions. So that's electricity and that's steam, where essentially, electricity is not magic. It just doesn't
mm-hmm.
come out as this emissionless energy source. It is coming from somewhere burning fuel. One of the things that I think always surprises people is that in lots of regions of the US, it's actually cleaner to burn natural gas than it is to use electricity. So an electric stove you think is going to have way less emissions, and if your electricity is coming 40% from coal, that natural gas is going to be cleaner than any electricity that you use. And then we have scope 3, which is all of the stuff upstream and downstream. And that is the wild west of everything. And that is where everything's an assumption. Almost everything's an assumption, I should say. And so, yeah, I would say that when it comes time to determine when to make an assumption versus not make an assumption, figure out what's within the scope versus out of the scope, we want to very transparently define that and say, this is what we're doing. These are the assumptions that we're making. And this is what we're not doing. And here is why. And here is our plan for trying to improve upon the system. When we look at greenhouse gas disclosures, there is no law or regulation for it. It's all voluntary reporting. And when we do this voluntary reporting, it's not that someone is judging based upon what those emissions are. If I tell you that Amazon had 300,000 metric tons of CO2e emitted last year, you probably have no idea or concept of whether or not that's a lot or a little. So the numbers in the end don't matter as much as it does that the process is put in place that you can trend and track these emission values over time, and that it's done in a way that you're making sure that you're set up for the future. And so even more importantly than identifying what your emissions are is what you're not considering as far as your emissions footprint goes. You say, I have no idea how many employees are driving cars to work, but maybe in a next year, we're going to send out some surveys and try to figure that out. I would much rather read that within a sustainability report than someone saying, hey, here is exactly how much emissions comes from employees commuting, because it just doesn't give you any sort of understanding of what the assumptions are. And it's basically setting them up for failure when an auditor comes in and says, this isn't right. And now they have to change everything, change their methodology.
That's so fascinating.
And when you're changing constantly, you're not trending anything.
You mentioned a few things there that are quite interesting. I think one, that it's greenhouse gas accounting, which is quite, similar to, I guess, financial accounting, where it does require kind of that level of, I guess, standardization. But at the same time, it seems like companies are almost free to report in the way that they want. But kind of towards the end there, you talked a little bit about kind of ESG auditors and them coming in and telling companies, hey, you need to adjust it. So like, where is that balance right now? Are we trying to kind of grapple with these standards? Do you see standards emerging? Are we kind of trending towards this direction where we'll eventually get something like GAP accounting, but for greenhouse gas?
Yeah. So basically, there are a lot of standards out there that are voluntary. And over time, they are becoming less and less kind of voluntary. Like if you are a Fortune 500 company, I think 85% of them are following the same three kind of standards that are out there. Now, the idea of auditing is if you're going to make public statements about what your emissions are, the government isn't going to audit you, but someone's going to ask, okay, has this been third party verified? And so next year, if you don't have, we've been third party verified in your sustainability report, it's going to raise some red flags. So again, it's not an ESG auditor that is like, no, you're wrong. It's more of, hey, I'm not going to allow you to put in your report that you have been verified. And then, that's going to stick out because everybody else is doing it. It is definitely a popularity contest kind of thing as well. You're the only one of the Fortune 500 companies out there that isn't making 2030 pledges. It doesn't matter how much against it you are. There's going to be lots of questions that get asked. There is so much in the space of ESG investments that they don't know much about ESG, but they have a checklist of things to look for. Some of the frameworks that exist right now, SASB is one that is presenting data that is very interesting to investors. We have CDP, or the Carbon Disclosure Project. What they do is they put out a survey every single year that is requesting a lot of the information regarding your emissions, but also how much building space you have, what's your output, what's your company revenue, and based upon how complete it is, and again, it doesn't have anything to do with, you could be the highest emitting company in the world. They will give you a grade. So even as the highest emitting company in the world, you can get an A plus. But it's all about how much of the information you are able to collect and disclose. Now, what that turns into is they make these grades publicly available. And I know that like a lot of the wholesalers or the larger companies like McDonald's, Walmart, they're starting to look at the grades for each of their individual suppliers. So, their suppliers, again, don't necessarily have to report their emissions. There's no sort of regulation that's saying if you're a trucking company, we need to know all of your emissions.
Mm-hmm.
But Walmart might be saying, hey, if you want to work with us, you need to give us your emissions. Otherwise, we're going to this other distributor over here who has an A for the CDP. So we're seeing a lot of the propagation of the importance of being able to disclose greenhouse gas emissions coming from the industry and corporations itself. Very little of it is actually coming from the government, which I definitely find interesting.
It's basically coming from policy that requires you to meet a certain level as score if you're building new construction. Which brings me to the next question: is there are many trends, so to say, in the built environment that talks about what's good, what's better for sustainability, like such as, oh, go for mass timber, like use a cross-laminated timber product. It has much lower carbon footprint than concrete or steel, and add heat pumps everywhere, massive house, like add a energy ventilator in your house. It will be much better. They really have an impact of what they promise.
That's why I think the focus is on the data, because yes, I do think that those things have an impact. Whether or not timber is used versus concrete versus all of these kind of things, they do have a small impact. And right now, we can use any impact that we want. And again, I think actually that is the one thing that goals do have going for it, is so many people are trying to do every single possible thing that they can to make sure that they are not going to, or that they hit their goals. And I don't think, yeah, and they're still going to miss it. It doesn't matter how much they're trying. But I do believe that each individual small thing does matter. But you do need to be careful too. I look at timber products, I look at plastic products. When we look at a plastic product, they say, it has a lot more life circularity. It can be recycled 10 times. Timber, can only be used once, maybe twice. And then more timber needs to be bought. And so all of the emissions that are associated with that timber, cutting it down, trucking, all these kind of things, need to consider all those. But in reality, you also need to look at it as timber is literal carbon sequestration itself. It is a piece of carbon. All of that CO2 came from out of the air and became this tree. And so you are, creating basically improvement that way. Also, buildings are very much the central topic when it comes to emission reductions right now, too. The first step a company usually takes when they are trying to make reductions is looking at electricity efficiency within their buildings. The idea is that nobody likes paying a high electricity bill. Anytime that you could use electricity, not only does it require less money from you, lower bills, but it also reduces the amount of greenhouse gas that's being released into the atmosphere. And so that idea of or building efficiency is kind of at the forefront of these emission reduction initiatives. The way that we have kind of seen certain things too is retrofitting these buildings and identifying ways to reduce that electricity. I am by no means a inspector that can be able to go out to a building and be able to say, change the flow on the refrigerant here, or, let's have an opening or a natural air opening during this time of the day to reduce, to make the building cooler. But what I look at is, okay, now that this has been implemented, what exactly are the impacts? If you just invested $10,000 to make this building more efficient, what are the impacts from an emissions perspective? What are the impacts from a financial perspective too? Eventually, even if you are saving $5 a month, eventually, when enough months pass, you're going to break even. So being able to implement those energy reduction technologies um, as quickly as possible, but also as effectively as possible, is going to save money in the long run. It's going to reduce the overall environmental impact in the long run as well. So I definitely kind of see a lot of these decisions that are being made in the architecture space. I hope it has a lot to do with the electricity efficiency, and it's going to be a lot more. That's going to be a lot more impactful than looking at the building materials themselves, I think.
I thought, turning away from fuel, gas fuel, to electricity was the answer, and that's happening in the new construction. Like every building is almost required to go fully electric. And you mentioned about the sources. In Massachusetts, I think there is this policy where they now have options and even incentives for people to just change their sources to a more clean source provided by their EverSource or energy providers. I guess my question is, like, how do you see this trend and perspective on this? Like, because buildings are basically trying to move away from fossil fuel, period. Is this a good or bad thing?
So yeah, you think about a stove that you might have, or a building heating that can either use natural gas or electricity. And the idea is that over time, electricity is going to become cleaner and cleaner. Right now, I believe that the U.S. grid, 40% of the electricity that is generated within the U.S. is coming from burning of natural gas. So, if you have electricity coming from the burning of natural gas versus just using natural gas at your own house, just due to the energy transfer that might be lost and the electricity going through the power line, natural gas burn in your house is going to be cleaner in the amount of energy that you get per emission. In other areas of the US, up to 60% of their grid might be fed from the burning of coal. Now, that electricity is going to be a lot dirtier than what natural gas is. But the idea is that coal and natural gas are going to be phased out over time. Those emissions that are associated with the generation of electricity is going to become lower and lower impact. Natural gas is always going to be natural gas. Whenever you burn natural gas, it's going to give off the same amount of emissions. So the idea is it's a two-part kind of thing. The idea first is creating that electrification to set ourselves up in the future to be able to have that renewable sort of electricity be directed towards the building. But then the second part is making sure that there are enough sources of renewable electricity through wind power, through solar power, through even hydropower, and these kind of things, in order to be able to feed the grid to meet that new demand. So as electricity becomes more and more prevalent, there's more and more of a demand. And right now, the US has been kind of very limited in the amount of renewable electricity that can be contributed to the grid simply because of a lot of factors.
Let's talk a little bit about I guess these standards and these reporting requirements. So it seems like there's kind of this trickle down effect. You mentioned earlier that a big company who's doing reporting might want their suppliers to meet a certain grade. You also mentioned before that buildings are a big component of these large companies' emissions. Like, I guess for developers, for builders, for building operators, like what kind of standards or what kind of requirements are these large companies making for their buildings?
Yeah. I would say that one of the things that we've seen a lot of interest in is looking at the life cycle assessment of building materials. So a life cycle assessment is essentially the cradle to grave process that any material might go through. So that starts with the manufacturing or even the procurement, or if we're looking at like a lithium battery, the mining or all of the emissions associated with even mining that battery. So life cycle assessment is kind of the cradle to grave carbon footprint associated with any material. And so that includes a lot of buildings. And so when a developer is looking to try to make a sustainable building, there's a couple of different aspects that go into it. There is the startup emissions cost, which comes from all of the different materials that are going into the building itself. I would say that the construction process, that's a little bit more convoluted and a little bit harder potentially to make reductions in. I don't know. I don't have too much insight into that process, but anytime we're talking about really heavy machinery, electricity isn't going to cut it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be a lot. You're going to have to burn some sort of fossil fuels to get those really high-powered cranes to work, for example. So the construction process itself is a little bit difficult to sort of make reductions. The materials, organizations might choose where they buy their materials from based upon that life cycle assessment. So I know that a lot of organizations that are suppliers of those materials are starting to do these life cycle assessments on their own products and actually do comparative analysis against other products. So they will essentially say, hey, for each unit of our product that you buy, this is what the emissions are going to be associated with that product from cradle to grave. However, here is the alternative that our competitors have, and here are the emissions that are associated with those. Now, if you are a developer and you see these two products side by side and there's the same exact price, and your investors are telling you, or your customers are saying, hey, we want more sustainable buildings, you're going to choose the greener product every single time. Emissions numbers are becoming very much a part of that decision-making process. They're not quite as important as just looking at price or quality or things like that, but they're quickly becoming part of that decision-making process and what kind of gets purchased. So I would say that from a developer standpoint, that emissions are kind of being included in that decision-making process of supplies and suppliers.
There are many incentives out there that's either coming from public entities
Yeah.
or private public entities that encourage people to actually track the life cycle assessment of a building. And I actually wanted to apply, but because of the timing, it didn't work. But yeah, I would agree. It is becoming its own currency, and I think the more advanced the data collection methodologies and technologies are available, the more important those numbers would be.
So I think as we wind down towards the end of the conversation, let's look to the future in this rapidly changing field. Dan, as someone who's well steeped in everything that goes on, what is kind of your vision of the future? What can we look forward to in the next 5 to 10 years?
In the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see lots of people missing their goals. And I think it's going to cause a lot of, I don't know, it's going to cause a lot of people to reframe things. I know, for example, that carbon offsets are seen as this very negative thing as they are right now because of an absolute lack of standards. But I see that idea that people just need to make reductions until we're down to zero. From everything that I have seen, and anybody and most of the companies that I work with, they're frantically trying to make reductions. There is no hesitation on that front. There is no financial gain in trying to avoid making those reductions. They are doing absolutely everything that they can, and we see it in how spending in ESG has almost doubled every year for the last several years. There is no lack of money at all going into ESG. I just think that the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be really, really important to make sure that that money is going to the right place. And I think that there's no better way to make sure that it's going to the right place than by looking at very quantifiable performance metrics. And so right now, all of the rave is about greenhouse gases, but there's other things that don't necessarily translate as well to greenhouse gases. You think of water usage. I could think of, if I have a plastic water bottle and I see a recycling bin or a trash can, I know that I will end up having, and so it's like, which one is the right choice when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions? And it's
Hmm.
neither, it's just to throw it on the ground and just walk away. Because the idea is that recycling, they're going to melt down the plastic. That results in greenhouse gas emissions. In a trash can, even, they're taking it from that trash can over to a landfill, and so that results in greenhouse gas emissions. But by just throwing it on the ground and leaving it, it's not going to create as many emissions. But is it good for the planet? Heck no. So I definitely see there being so much
Hmm.
importance around greenhouse gas emissions and all of the goals being set towards that. And I'm a huge fan of it because it's one of the very first times that we're getting quantifiable data to determine the environmental impacts that we have on society. But I do think that over time it's going to flesh out a little bit more, and it's going to be, a little bit less one-dimensional. I kind of see society is being introduced to this brand new kind of economy that just never really existed 10 years ago, but now is becoming absolutely universal. If we see something like a carbon tax, every single individual organization out there is going to be looking at how to put their money to the best use possible in order to be able to reduce
Hmm.
emissions or pay the government who is going to use that data or that money to reduce emissions. And it's literally didn't exist 10 years ago, and now it's going to be a universal sort of product. And to me, that is just wild. I can't think of anything else that has that level of universality, and for that to just come into fruition out of nothing within 10 to 15 years, it's just crazy to me. So yeah, I think that's what I find really interesting about it. If you're going to make a goal, and really put importance on it, you need to understand how to get to that goal first and try to figure out what your process is to get there. To just say we're going to get to this goal because we hope the right technology comes along, it's setting yourself up for failure. So I do see it from that aspect that it's setting up for failure. But that said, to me, any success is any reduction that we could possibly get right now. Because for since the industrial age, emissions have been going up every single year. And now it's finally looking like there is a lot of importance being put on it. Wish it happened 25, 45 years ago, but it is the time when the world is starting to recognize it as an issue and try to change the trajectory. And that's the significance that I see. And I don't see that part as a failure.
So in this new economy, in the face of this great challenge that's hard to overcome, as I'm sweating in a heat wave in New York,
Yeah.
clearly evident of this greenhouse emissions history that we have. What are, I guess, some moonshot technologies? These things that, if it were to happen, that we would make maybe great leaps in this pursuit of lowering our emissions.
Yeah, I think the greatest one is some sort of carbon air capture technology. I know it's not always technologies either. There's also processes, things like that. I know that, probably seen in the news maybe a little while ago how much the carbon footprint of coffee is. So we have goals being set to reduce the amount of water that needs to be used for these individual farms by 50%. We need to reduce the amount of emissions produced by these farms and the farm hands on them by 50%. So Cool. Okay. So now we don't necessarily have a technology, but let's go ahead and try to figure out what that is so that we use 50% less water. Well, if that technology existed already, people would be implementing it already. Like, obviously, nobody wants to pay for more water. But, there's, I think, I don't know, there's a lot of money being introduced into research and development to figure out exactly how that can be done. And that money wasn't necessarily there before. So it is possible that we can get to a point where that technology might be discovered, put together the brightest minds and give them a goal, and maybe they'll get to it. But then you also have to look at the aspect of, if you are a coffee company, you probably have farms in 27 different countries. And how are you
Hmm.
going to get that technology rolled out to all 27? And how long is that going to take? So it's complicated. It's really, really complicated, and still no technology yet. But lots of money being spent to try to figure it out. So
We can hope for the best and hope we get lucky.
I think that's like one of the big misconceptions that I've seen, is that um, you know that everybody is scared of the bottom dollar. That all these different companies, all the big ones out there that are profit driven, are creating environmental programs because they want to, make more money, or they're not doing the right things because they don't want to affect their bottom line and that kind of stuff. But in reality, it is probably the case. That's probably true. But at the same time, all of that is because there is an impending doom of a carbon tax, or carbon impacts, or impacts caused by climate change that are coming along. And so the idea is that these companies are absolutely doing
Hmm.
what they can to make reductions, and there is no shortage of spending. Again, I just think that the most important thing is making sure that that spending goes to the right places, the most effective places. Yeah.
Well, if I'm a company and I'm looking to spend money in the right places, how should I get in touch with you, Dan?
Yeah, I guess you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You guys have a comment section, all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
we will link it in the comment section so you can find Dan. And we'd like to thank you for sharing your knowledge in this great episode.
Yeah,
Thank you, our listeners, for listening to another episode of the Most Pioneer Podcast. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening. Thank you so much.
I love talking about this stuff.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트.